Welcome to Voice of Stories. Discover tales that inspire, captivate, and bring words to life. Subscribe for unforgettable stories.
Sophie stood frozen, her chest tightening as she watched her brother Jake lean casually against the doorframe, a smug grin on his face. He held her mother's diary in one hand, waving it slightly. "Looking for this?" he asked, his tone mocking. Sophie's voice trembled as she demanded, "Give it back." Jake chuckled, flipping through the pages carelessly. "What's in here that's so important? Secrets about dear old Dad? Or maybe something about Mom?" Sophie felt her heart race. "Please, Jake," she begged. His smirk faltered for a moment before he snapped the diary shut and crossed his arms. "You shouldn't mess with things you don't understand," he said, his voice suddenly cold. Sophie's fists clenched. "You don't understand either," she shot back. "You don't know what he's done." Jake's gaze hardened, leaning in closer. "Oh, I know," he said quietly, his eyes darkening. "I know exactly what he's done, and you should stop poking around before you make things worse for both of us." Sophie's stomach churned. "If you know, why don't you do something?" she asked, her voice rising with frustration. Jake looked away, his expression clouded. "Because it doesn't matter," he muttered. "Nobody's going to believe you. Nobody's going to stop him." He tossed the diary onto her bed and turned to leave. "Keep it," he said, but his tone was laced with finality. "But don't say I didn't warn you." Sophie sat on her bed, clutching the diary tightly. His words echoed in her mind, feeding the knot of fear in her chest. Sometimes Jake seemed just as trapped as she was, but other times he was a shadow of Brian following his every command. Downstairs she could hear Brian's deep voice and Jake's lighter one mingling in conversation. Sophie opened the diary, flipping to a random page. The words made her breath catch. He started watching Sophie more closely. "I see it in the way he talks to her, the way he stands over her. She's just a baby, and already he's trying to control her like he does me. I have to find a way out before it's too late." Sophie slammed the diary shut, her hands trembling. Her mother had tried to protect her and failed. Now, it was up to Sophie. That evening, the tension in the house was suffocating. Sophie picked at her food, barely listening to Brian and Jake, who continued their conversation as if nothing was wrong. Emily, however, barely touched her plate, her gaze fixed on her food. Brian suddenly turned to Sophie. "What's this I hear about you sneaking off to Margaretha's house?" Sophie froze, her fork clinking onto her plate. I wasn't sneaking," she stammered. "Don't lie to me." Brian's voice was cold. Jake smirked but said nothing. Sophie's heart sank. "She's just a lonely old woman," Sophie said quickly. "She asked me to help with her garden." Brian's eyes narrowed, but he didn't press further. "Stay away from her," he ordered firmly. Sophie nodded, swallowing hard. That night she waited until the house was silent before sneaking downstairs. She couldn't stay here much longer, not with Brian watching her every move, and Jake acting like an unpredictable storm. She found Emily sitting in the living room, staring out the window with a vacant expression. Sophie hesitated before whispering, "Mom?" Emily turned, startled. "What is it?" she asked. Sophie's voice was shaky. "I need your help. I need to get out of here." Emily's face crumpled as she shook her head. "I can't, Sophie. Brian would never let you go. He'd never let me go." Tears pricked Sophie's eyes. "Then why don't you fight him?" she demanded. "Why do you just let him do whatever he wants?" Emily's shoulders slumped. "I'm trying," she whispered. "I really am. But it's not as easy as you think." Sophie's anger bubbled to the surface. "It's easy if you care," she snapped, immediately regretting the words as they left her mouth. She turned and ran back to her room, leaving Emily alone in the dark. The next day, Sophie spent most of her time in her room, rereading the diary and trying to come up with a plan. She thought about Margarita's offer to help her go to the police, but After Brian's threat, Sophie wasn't sure if Margarita would still be willing. As the sun set, Sophie made a decision. She couldn't wait any longer. She grabbed the diary and slipped out the back door, heading straight for Margarita's house. When Margarita opened the door, she looked both surprised and worried. "Sophie, what are you doing here?" she asked, glancing nervously toward the street. "I need your help," Sophie said urgently. "I found my mom's diary. It has everything in it. Everything Brian did to her." Margarita stepped aside, her expression softening. "You did the right thing coming here," she said. "We'll figure this out together." But before Sophie could respond, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway sent a jolt of fear through her. It was Brian. Margarita moved quickly, stepping toward the door. "Stay upstairs," she said in a low voice. "Don't come down until I say it's safe." Sophie hesitated but nodded, her heart pounding as she crept upstairs. She crouched by the window, watching Brian through the small gap. He stepped out of his car, his posture rigid, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, looking angrier than she had ever seen him. Downstairs, Margarita opened the door before Brian could knock. "Good evening, Brian," she said, her voice calm but firm. "What brings you here?" "I think you know why I'm here," Brian said, his cold tone sending a shiver down Sophie's spine. "Sophie's been spending too much time here. I don't appreciate you interfering with my family." Margarita crossed her arms, standing her ground. "She's a smart girl," she replied evenly. "Smarter than you give her credit for, and she deserves better than the way you treat her." Brian's jaw tightened. "Stay out of my business, Margarita," he growled, his tone threatening. "This is your last warning." Margarita didn't flinch. "And what happens if I don't?" she challenged. For a long moment, Brian said nothing. Then, in a dangerous whisper, he leaned in closer. "Accidents happen all the time," he said, his voice low. "You wouldn't want one, would you?" Sophie felt her body freeze, wanting to shout, to do something, but she was paralyzed with fear. Margarita didn't back down. "If something happens to me, Brian, there will be plenty of people who will want to know why, and I'll make sure they look straight at you." Brian's eyes narrowed, a cruel smile curling on his lips. "You always were too nosy for your own good," he sneered. "But suit yourself." He turned abruptly and stalked back to his car, slamming the door behind him. The tires screeched as he sped off, leaving a trail of dust in his wake. Margarita closed the door and locked it, leaning against the frame with a heavy sigh. "Sophie?" she called softly. Sophie crept downstairs, clutching the diary to her chest. "Is he gone?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "For now," Margarita said, though worry flickered in her eyes. "But we need to move quickly. He won't stop." Sophie nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the weight of the coming storm,